Next, from Springfield, Matthew Dowd, a political analyst for ABC News and former chief strategist for the Bush-Cheney 2004 campaign, delivers an address at the Illinois Retail Merchants Association Business Day on the growing political divide in the country. This runs about 45 minutes.
It's great to be here. I'm going to fill in a couple of blanks so you guys get a background on me. I grew up with 10 brothers and sisters in Detroit and learned early on that if you didn't make money in some way, you weren't going to have basically anything and you'd have to wear your brother's shirts. So I started as an entrepreneur very early on, started a lawn cutting business, started a painting business, did it all the way through college, and I've started 3 or 4 businesses in Austin, in Texas, where I am. So I understand, I think, this community exceedingly well, why capitalism really has been a force for good, though there's been mistakes that have been made along the way, and there's many things we need to do, how it's been a force for good in the world. I think today's a perfect opportunity, I think, to have this conversation that we're having and for you to do what you're doing. One, it's this 100-day standard that we're all hearing about that Donald Trump is facing, though he, for some reason, called it ridiculous when he kept talking about the 100-day standard. And so it's an important moment. And the 100-day standard, though it's not predictive, I mean, if you look back at presidents, some presidents had really bad 100 days and ended up being reelected and having great presidencies. Some presidents had great 100 days and ended up having failed presidencies. It really was, as you realize, FDR was the one who started it in 1933, and it was really started as more of a sort of PR thing, which obviously the country was in the Great Depression. We needed to have confidence in, again, government, that they could respond to the needs and hopes and dreams of the people, of the American public, and so he pushed it as a way to rebuild confidence. I think today we are obviously in a very tumultuous time, a time of great change, a time that has caused many people to be frustrated at all levels, anxious, in fear for many different reasons. But for me, it's a great moment of optimism, I would say, and hope. Because in moments when everybody's sort of satisfied with the status quo, you can't have the change that needs to happen, especially in the leaders that we need at all levels in our country. And so I think we're in that accelerated moment today. In the midst of it, we all question it, right? We all wonder, like, what's going to happen, what is going on at every level. And I was talking at the table, we talk about the dysfunction in Washington, which obviously everybody sees every day. But what's happened in Washington is become a virus, right? And the virus is spreading itself across the country. And it's affecting many other places of state government that we have that become polarized, divided, tribalized, all those sorts of things. People only holding on to their talking points and not actually basing policies and things on evidence and on facts. And that is spreading across the country. But one of the things I want to emphasize is we need to figure out the best way to push back. You in this room, and first I want to say some gratitude to you all for the work you do. To me, I think the change in this country that we need is not going to be, let's go find us a president, or let's go find us a United States senator, or even a governor. It is our responsibility. It's our responsibility that we have. And the positions of power that you have in your local communities, I've made my way all the way up from working on the most basic races around the country, state rep and city council, all the way up to working in the White House. And I've discovered that the greatest amount of change occurs in the local level first, in neighborhoods first, in communities first. The incubators for our democracy is never going to be Washington. It's going to be in every other smaller town, smaller community around the country that then it builds. And so one of the things I want to reflect on is, how are we in this moment? Why do we get here? So everybody recalls the campaign last year, the 18-month, kind of boring campaign that we all went through. And we're now in the midst of a start of an administration that has high levels of energy and excitement surrounding it. About a year and a half ago, many of you know David Axelrod. He's an old friend of mine. He and I actually did campaigns years and years and years ago before he ended up working for President Obama and I ended up working for President Bush. He is running the Political Institute at the University of Chicago. So he called me up about a year and a half ago And he said, hey, let's do a seminar together where we talk about the campaign and the primaries and what's going on in the Republican and Democratic primary and what's likely to happen. I said, so great. So it was going to be a once-a-week seminar at the University of Chicago for students and professors. Awesome. So we debated back and forth. We couldn't decide on a name. And so I finally, name of the seminar. So I finally called up David. I said, why don't we just call it what it is? Campaign 2016 WTF. And we called it at the University of Chicago, that was the name of the seminar, which seemed in the end to sort of reflect it very well. We ended up in this election, and in a moment now, we are in an unprecedented time, but as I'll talk about, predictable. So simultaneously unprecedented, but very predictable. On election day, we end up with two immensely flawed candidates, and for the first time in our history, since we've been doing polls in the last 80 years, both major party candidates were disliked and distrusted by a majority of the country, and both major parties were disliked and distrusted by a majority of the country on election day. And the public was told, choose between those. And they made a choice, in many people's minds, a difficult choice in the process. And then, obviously, what we had, to use your boxing analogy, it went to the cards, and it was a split decision on election day. Somebody won the Electoral College, somebody won the popular vote. And then we have an administration today setting more historical standards. Donald Trump started out in the day of his inauguration with the lowest approval rating of any entering president. Donald Trump is going to end his first 100 days with the lowest approval rating of any president since Harry Truman. And that's the last time before that we weren't polling on this. And so we are in an unprecedented moment in time. As I say, I think it's exciting, but this is not just a moment that's happening in the United States of America. This is a global situation. As everybody in this room knows, we're all connected now. We're connected in a global nature, and we can't just say we're isolated to ourselves here. Everything goes together, and what's occurring in the United States, politically and all that, is occurring in other countries around the world because of the nature of our economy, the nature of our culture, the nature of our entertainment. All of those things are interrelated. Brexit was England's version of Donald Trump. What's the elections in France are another reflection of that. The elections we've had in South America, the elections that are going to take place in Germany, all of those things are reflecting a changing global environment that voters are responding to. But I think we need to understand this not just as looking at the volcanoes and the earthquakes that erupt or disrupt. Too often, we just look at a volcano and we look at an earthquake and say, we focus on that and say, oh my gosh, how did this happen? How did this thing happen? And we miss the shifting of the tectonic plates. And the tectonic plates of our country have been shifting for 25 years. They've been shifting economically. They've been shifting culturally. They've been shifting politically. They've been shifting in the media environment. They've been shifting for a while. And the election and what happened in the election at many levels, Bernie Sanders represented part of that. Donald Trump represents part of that. The administration represents part of that. But as a shift, which is why the predictable nature of this, if we had paid attention to the shifting tectonic plates, we would have understood that this change and this disruption was coming. How it evidenced itself, obviously, was unknown, but this was going to erupt at some point because of all those shifts going on. I'm a huge believer in the cycles of history. I think we're in a moment that doesn't come along, that only comes along every 70 or 80 years. We are in that type of moment today. And as I was reflecting at the Lincoln Library and Museum today, it sort of comes to bear as you watch that, which I'll discuss in a moment. So if you think about where we were 70 or 80 years ago before today, we were in the midst of the Great Depression, the third industrial revolution, where we had moved from industrial to much more mass production, and we were going into World War II. And if you think about where we were 80 years ago before that, 70 or 80 years ago before that, we were in the midst of the Civil War and changing from an agrarian-based economy to an industrial-based economy. And if you think about where we were 70 or 80 years ago before that, we were in the midst of the American Revolution, the first establishment of the world's first modern democracy. We are in that type of moment today. And so when you look at it, there's huge aspects of those shifts, those tectonic shifts that are occurring. One, economic. We're in the midst of the third industrial revolution of our country. Everyone in this room knows it, whether it's you're in retail, manufacturing, whatever he happens to know in. All of it's being driven by a changing environment, primarily technology, which is changing all the ways we interrelate, we work, all of those sorts of things. It's basically a third industrial revolution in that. The average person today in this economy changes jobs 7 times before they're 30 years old. The average person changes jobs. And think about what that does. There used to be people, our parents, some of you worked in the same job 30, 35, 40 years. And people knew they had what the retirement was, they knew what their health insurance was. All of those things were much more predictable than it is today in our economy today. The second major thing is technological. You have in your hand or your pocket access to information, more access to information in your hand or pocket than would 15 years ago if you filled this room from floor to ceiling with computers, ran them 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. You have more access to information in your hand today than you would have had in that room running today. And that's just from everything. The average person today has 220 channels into their house, there's satellite radio, there's all the access to the internet, all of those sorts of things. But a warning, we have more access to knowledge today than ever before in the history of the world. But we have less wisdom. We have more knowledge but less wisdom. It's raining data, but we have a thirst for perspective. We have a thirst for our leaders and people to start to say, take all that information, take that and tell us what's really going on, what does it really mean? And because we thought knowledge pieces were going to solve it, many people have become lost in that sea of knowledge without a perspective and without wise leaders to guide them through that. The third thing is cultural change. Immense cultural change that we have to understand and how that's impacted people's lives. Everything from what's going on with race, what's going on in people's lives, relationships. We've redefined marriage in the last 5 or 6 years that people held for thousands of years. And those wrenching cultural changes causes lots of disruption, causes lots of anxiety, causes lots of concern in the country and in our states. And the final thing, which is all those three I think cause it or help attribute to it, is our institutions. We've lost faith and trust in nearly every single one of our institutions that bound us together simultaneously. Almost every single one of our institutions we've lost faith and trust in simultaneously. Corporate institutions, they used to be seen as much more paternalistic, but because of scandals that people have seen, they now view them as much less than paternalistic today. And the standouts, the corporations that stand out very, very brightly in that. But it's not the same corporate culture that used to be in this country and how people viewed it. Our media institutions. We now gather media. There's a thing called we now gather information, unfortunately, in a biased way. Republicans and conservatives watch Fox News. Democrats and liberals or progressives watch MSNBC. They all have their own radio shows. They all have their own blog sites they go to. They all have their own internet sites they go to. And so people don't trust any other media but the one they think feeds their own concern or gives them information in that. Our political institutions. The two major parties today, for the first time ever, are viewed negatively by a vast majority of the country. Both major political parties today. That's unusual because normally what happens is Democrats rise, Republicans fall. Republicans rise, Democrats fall. They're both at their lowest or near their lowest level of acceptance in the country than they've ever been since polling started. And finally, our governmental institutions, starting with the federal government. We trust that we are at the lowest point of trust and faith in our government, starting with the federal government, but it's dwindled at the state level. The only level of government that we still fundamentally trust, American public, is local government, because people can see, feel, and touch it. They feels much more responsive to people's needs, so we trust overwhelmingly local government. We trust state government more than the federal government, but less than we did. But the federal government, I think the last poll I saw was that the level of trust for the federal government was 14% positive, 82% negative. Think about that, 14% positive, 82% negative. I said one time it ranks somewhere above bubonic plague and below lice, right? And somebody asked me after, well, why is it below lice? I said, well, because you can get rid of lice. That situation that we have is not sustainable. That's it's a situation we're in. As I said, it's exciting, it's a moment for change, but it's not sustainable. And one of the first things we have to figure out is people are trying to figure out what is the truth. What is the truth? What can I believe? So in a time of alternative facts and fake news and rigged polls and all of the things, everybody calls everybody else fake news. If you don't disagree with somebody, if you don't agree with somebody, they're fake news. If they don't agree with you, you're fake news. Whatever the thing happens to be, but there is a tremendous search for the truth. And I believe, and I shameless shill for my book, my new book, that I believe that truth is a paradox, because the world is a place of great uncertainty, but there is a truth to be discovered at whatever level it happens to be, but it's hard. And it's a lifelong journey of the discovery of the truth. Normally what happens is this debate always seems to come down between absolutists who say everything's black and white, the truth is, it always has been, always will be, this is the way it is, there's no changing, it always is. And they hold on to it. Then there's the relativists. There is no truth. You have your truth, I have my truth, you have your truth. There's 100 different truths. It all doesn't matter. Just move on. Let's not worry about it. I think we have to figure out a process to discover what that truth is in this moment. As I say, the problem is we all have biases. Every single person in this room has prejudices and biases. And if you say you don't, you're obviously, you're deluded in this. I have them. It's what race you were born into, what sex you were born, what family you were raised in, what college you went to, what community you belong, what job your father had, what your mother did. Whatever those things are, over the course of your life, put you a lens on life that doesn't always let you see what's actually going on in reality and what it is, and you sometimes make judgments from those biases. But we have to figure out a way not to feed them, like the media that people search for, because it's so much easier to go find media that agrees with you, because you nod your head as opposed to some media that makes you uncomfortable in the course of this, which I think is a desperate need that we have in this. But how do you do that in the space that we need leaders to be in? We need leaders to act, right? We need leaders to act. But we need leaders first to be reflective and contemplative, to sort of sit back and not just respond to the same talking point, not just to take the sheet that somebody hand them and said, here's what you're going to need to do, but have some level of reflection and contemplation to overcome partisan biases, to overcome other biases, to sort of do what's in the interest of the country. I'll tell you a story that goes to this, how we all have a journey on this to get through our biases and get through some level of self-reflection so we can see our own faults, see our own part in this, is Bono. And so Bono, obviously amazing musician, he wanted to hire me for a thing called the One Campaign, big effort that he was doing. And Bono's done just great things around the world, in Africa, on poverty and hunger, around the world on various health things, all of those things. So he said he wants to meet with me, so I said sure. So first we're going to meet in New York, and that doesn't work out, it falls through. And then he says come to Washington, and that doesn't work out, that falls through. And finally he says why don't you come to Dublin where he lives, and I'm going to go to Dublin, and that falls through. And so he says let's come to France. So I plan a trip to France for 30 hours, to fly from Texas to France, have a meeting with him, and fly back. So I do, I fly there. So I'm driving up, this is in the south of France, Bono's house in the south of France, and I'm driving up this long drive to a castle that he lives in, overlooking the Mediterranean Sea. I mean, unbelievable south of France, beautiful Mediterranean Sea, 21-room castle that he has. I think it was built in the 1700s or something. And I go out to his back courtyard with this gorgeous view, and he's serving $600 bottles of French wine and expensive French cheese, and I think we had Chateaubriand, whatever it happens to be, and we're having a little chit-chat. He puts his fork down with all this going on, and he says, let's talk about poverty and hunger. It's exactly what I did. I started laughing out loud. And he got this sort of serious look on his face. It's like, why are you laughing? I said, don't you see the irony of this, what's happening here? And he paused and he smiled. He said, wow, I never thought about that. Nobody's ever said that to me before. So even the best of us need a level of self-reflection. There's a great writer and author and thinker. His name was Joseph Campbell. If anybody of you know him, he's written a lot on myth, this history of myth. He wrote a great book called The Power of Myth. And he's examined civilizations and cultures and religions all over the world. Just a fabulous thinker and writer. And he talks about the importance of myth all the myths that were sort of talked about and told, whether it was over a campfire or written down, from the Greek gods to, to the Roman gods, to the Bible, stories in the Bible, all these things, there were some, you didn't always believe everything around it, but there was some truth that it pointed to. Sort of the myth represented some truth, some lesson to be learned, some moral thing that we're supposed to take away from that. And so he wrote about how myths could take you closer to the truth. But what we've had today, and I would say it's both political parties are learning the wrong lessons from nearly every election, but especially this last election. Both parties are learning the wrong lesson from this last election. But there's myths that have developed that are taking us further away from the truth. And I'll talk about 4 of them. You could probably do many, but 4 myths that have developed. The first one, Donald Trump is the cause of all the change. That's a myth. Everybody putting responsibility for Donald Trump for all the change and the disruption that's occurred in the country is a myth. Donald Trump is the result of the change. Donald Trump's rise and success and what he's done is because of all of this change, as I talked about from the beginning. The other thing is Donald Trump, we need candidates that act and behave like Donald Trump. That's the sort of myth. We got to go find us some more candidates like Donald Trump. Donald Trump won in spite of himself, not because of himself. Think about that. Donald Trump on election day, 62% of the country had an unfavorable view of Donald Trump. 25% of the people that voted for Donald Trump did not think he was qualified and did not think he had the temperament to be president and voted for him. And so when you look at that and look at that election, it's not those patterns in that first one. The second one, this election was all about Donald Trump. It wasn't about Hillary Clinton. This election was as much about Hillary Clinton as it was about Donald Trump. The response, whether it's positively to Hillary Clinton or negatively to Hillary Clinton, this election was as much about her. And it was as much as a response to that, to her and the presentation of her as a candidate and what, in many people's minds, as I say, positively and negatively, she represented, as much as it was about Donald Trump. Third, yes, this was a change election. It was a change election. But merely saying that perpetuates a myth that there was somehow people were going change forward. Many voters on election day were responding to change, not pushing change. They were saying the change has been too much, too fast, too great in my life. I want to figure out some way to stop, slow down. You know, I want to change backward. I want to go back. I liked it when my community and the leaders behaved like this, or where they looked like this, or our schools were like this, or I had a job like my father had. All of those things. And so, yes, part of this election was a change forward, but a huge part of this election was a response to the fear of all the change that has occurred so quickly, so much in our country. The final thing of the myths is independents can't win. Independents can't win. And this is a myth, I think, perpetuated by and large by the duopoly, the 2 major political parties of our country, the red and the blue. And that couldn't be further from the truth. The fastest growing group of voters in our country today are independents. People that say, I'm tired of both political parties. They're not getting anything done. They're not addressing the concerns of the country. They're not doing the job they're supposed to be done. I'm tired of it. I want something new. And if you think about the election, think about this. Independence just doesn't mean somebody running in a third party or somebody running on their own. It means people running in the Democratic Party that are sick of the broken system and people running in the Republican Party that are sick of the broken system. Bernie Sanders was an independent, 74-year-old socialist senator from one of the smallest states, Vermont, of the country. 50 points behind with no money, and ended up winning 22 primaries and caucuses and almost beat Hillary Clinton, who had every single endorsement, all the money in the world when she started, all the establishment behind her. He was basically running as an independent within the Democratic primary. Donald Trump changed parties 7 times in 14 years. Think about that. Donald Trump was a Republican, then he was an independent, then he was a Democrat, then he was a Republican again, and then he was a Democrat again, and then he was a Republican. Whatever those number of steps, I might have skipped one in that. Donald Trump basically did a hostile takeover of the Republican Party. He did fundamentally a hostile takeover. The Republicans, the leadership didn't want him. He wasn't a part of that, but he basically, he ran as a Republican, but he was basically an independent, divorced from the system that existed. The barrier quality of the parties is broken. The gatekeeper ability of the parties to keep everything out and everything sorted out is gone. And so I think what you're going to see is a rise of independence in our country, is a rise of people running in various places, in Illinois, in Texas, in California. They're basically say, the system's broken, I'm tired, I'm going to run. It does not going to succeed by a national level. Everybody says, well, where's the independent? We need to get Michael Bloomberg to run for president. Or we need to get somebody else, Howard Schultz from Starbucks or somebody else to run for president. Independent movements are like democracies. You can't establish them from the top down. We've learned in the history of the world, in the last 15 years, is you can't impose a democracy on a place that the grassroots and the people don't want. And so independents are going to rise, and then it's going to move in a much broader national. And watch this happen over the next 5 or 7 years. It's going to emerge and it's going to grow greatly because of the frustration level people have. And so when you look at the country today, look at the election and look at where we are today, there's many battles going on, but there's two huge political ones happening today that are undecided, and there hasn't been a victor yet. And the first one is geography versus demography. If you think about this, geography is, look at a map of the United States and the election results. Look at the map. There's little edges of blue along the oceans, the Atlantic Pacific Ocean, and then there's dots of blue in urban areas around the country, and it's a sea of red. Republicans own geography. They look at anything, and most political jurisdictions are based on geography. So you say that's going to benefit the Republican Party. Then you look at demography. We have the largest rising group of non-white voters in our country's history, more single people, more people that are view social and cultural issues progressively, less churched people, and that doesn't mean, I don't mean less people believing in God, but less people going to church in the manner that their parents did. So a less church population, you look at that and say Democrats, which Democrats bet on, Democrats can't lose in that environment. And that battle is still hasn't been decided, geography versus demography in our country. And the second one is restoration versus transformation, which is, I like the values from before, I liked what it was before, I want to go back, I want to restore what was, and transformation, which is we have to move into the future. The country is changing, we're moving, we got to change, we got to adapt, we got to move. And that battle occurred on Election Day, and it's still occurring today. So in this environment, what do we do? What do we do? What's the solution to this? To me, we have to look at our founders, the founders of this country. To me, when you look at who's going to lead the change, it's going to be entrepreneurs and artists. Think about that, entrepreneurs and artists. And entrepreneurs and artists are the great disruptors. Anybody in a business community that comes up with innovative ideas is not interested in the status quo, is interested in disrupting the environment. Whether it's you're in a company that you come up with a new way to look at things, a new way to sort of talk about your product, a new way to sort of invite people in, all of those are disruptive, and all of that is entrepreneurial. The second thing is artists. Whether it's music, art in whatever manner it is, people's reflection on things causing them to think about something else. And our founders of our country were the ultimate entrepreneurs. They had a startup. It's called a country. And the founders, keep this in mind, the founders were men, mostly white men, were men of power, men of means, men of prestige. They were well connected to the monarchy. They had all the land they wanted. They had everything they wanted. They had every piece of power that they wanted, but they basically decided it wasn't working. We need to start something new. They put their fortunes, their lives on the lines, and they basically launched this startup, which is America, the United States of America today. And so when we're looking at a new way and how to navigate this and the leaders we need to push in all of this, we have to retain the values that we've always believed in. Integrity, honesty, respect, dignity, the values that have sort of been with us as human beings. But we have to figure out to move in a way, tactically and strategically, in a way that's transformative. And how do we do that? It's got to be innovative. It's got to be independent of the old way, of the old models that we've sort of gotten used to. It's got to retain integrity, a level of integrity that the public really wants to see. And it's got to have some level of imagination, imagining a different way in this. I have 7, I'm going to close with, oh my gosh, I was like, The police came and the whole table got... I don't know what to say about that. We have to first, 7 things, sort of 7 little quick things that go there. Country over party. We have to demand our leaders put country over party. Stop with the mantra that this is what the Democrats do and this is what the Republicans do and the talking points and all that. Put country over party. The whole has got to be more important than the parts. Second, the means of governance are broken. Everybody in this room knows this. And before we get to the ends, in demanding the ends that we want, that are important, we have to demand that the means of governance change. If you don't have a means that works, you're never going to get to a good end. You're never going to get to a good end. And we have to end the ends justify the means politics in governance. That I'm just going to do this because it causes me to win. I'm going to do this and it's going to get me there. It's going to get me to 50% plus 1. We have to end the ends justify the means in politics today. Third, we need to, and I think the pendulum is swinging, we need humble servant leaders. Abraham Lincoln is a perfect example. You walk through that museum, you read about his life, what it's an unbelievable place he started from, what he ended up, retaining his level of humility. And humility doesn't mean lack of confidence or lack of strength. The pendulum, I think, has pushed so far to a culture on both sides of the aisle that has been celebritized and entertainment-driven and all of those sorts of things that it's going to swing back. It may require a push on our part. But we have to have politicians that are humble servant leaders. Then as Gandhi said, that what they say, what they think and what they say and what they do are in alignment. What they think and what they say and what they do are in alignment. Not living one way or saying one thing one way and governing in a totally different way. We have to, in order to have a democracy in America, you have to be able to get to the common good. In a tribalized culture, of the history of the world, you cannot have a democracy if people can't come out of their tribes. Look at every nation that has succeeded with democracy and every nation that's failed. And every nation that has succeeded, people come out of their tribe and they do work in the common good. And the ones that don't succeed are they can't get out of their tribe. We are in a moment of time where people are having a difficult time coming out of their tribe. But before you get to the common good, we have to have a common set of facts. We have to have a set of facts that we can all say, we may disagree about policy, but we have the same set of facts. Because the problem is, if you have an opinion and you have an opinion and I have an opinion, we can sit down and have a conversation and probably resolve something. But if you have a set of facts and you have a set of facts and I have a set of facts, there's no resolution. There's no way to resolve that when there's a multiple set of facts. 5, we need local action with a big vision. We need big, broad vision. Where do we want to be? What do we want to do? And we have to act tactically locally. It's amazing to me, there's sort of a irony in this, is that people on one hand have a difficult time seeing the ability to think big, but they also simultaneously don't understand they need to act small, the power of acting small and of acting locally. We think, oh, we're going to go to Washington and convince them to do this and all of this, or we're going to go do this and convince somebody to do this. So they either have a vision that's not big enough, as leaders, each of us, that's not big enough, and what do we really want to accomplish? It can't just be, I just want to make an incremental change. It's got to be a big or broad enough vision, but you have to tactically maneuver locally and in small ways. That's where the change will fundamentally occur. 6 of these 7. We have a huge empathy gap, if you think, in this country, an unbelievable empathy gap. We're unwilling, many of us, to sort of have empathy for somebody that's of an opposite view of us. We sort of look at somebody, they voted a certain way or did a certain way, and we said, I can't believe they're just stupid, or whatever the thing happens to be. And we have inability to understand where their hopes and fears are, what they're going through, and a level of civility and kindness, which is required in empathy. But every side in this, we have to have an ability to have an empathy. We have to bridge the empathy gap in our country in order to get there. We can do it. As I say, it starts locally. And part of that is we can't let small segments on each side capture the conversation about faith and patriotism in our country. We can't let patriotism and faith be defined by a very small group of people on each side. The majority of the country are people of faith. The majority of the country are people who are patriots. But they don't necessarily define it in the same way the sort of segments on one side and the other defines it. And finally, we have to Before you have a political conversation, and I would say as you go to the state capitol, and how do you relate, and how do you connect, and how do you bond with people, don't bond over politics. Because either you're going to get in an argument or you're going to get somebody that totally agrees with you and you're not doing anything anyway. Bond over shared joys and sorrows. And so if we want to bridge the divide is going to be first bridged by bonding over shared joy or sorrow, whatever that happens to be. It's always been the case. Before you talk about politics, before you get into any of that policy, whatever, people have to understand that you know where they stand in their shoes. You know what they've been through on something. Whether it's somebody with a shared disability, or somebody that's gone through drug addiction with somebody, or alcoholism with somebody, or somebody that's lost a child, or whatever that thing is, that shared joy or shared sorrow, whatever happens to be, or somebody that fell in love, or whatever it is, that's the beginning of bridging this. Because here's why. You can't break an emotional bond with a rational argument. You cannot break an emotional bond that somebody has with a rational argument. And too often I see constantly people, I can't understand. I've told them these 5 things, and it's logical, and they're not convinced. You cannot break. And so when people ask me, why do 97% of Trump voters still with Trump? After of course they describe it, after all of this, why are they still with him? Because Donald Trump has an emotional bond with a huge segment of America. Because in many ways, he spoke for a group of voters that felt forgotten, that felt left behind, that didn't feel represented in this. And the way he has that, it's not going to be broken because somebody on the news says, here's 10 things that is not going to break it. The only thing that breaks one emotional bond is another emotional bond. And then once you have that emotional bond, as I say, then you can have a rational conversation, and you can go through all the things, get to a place where you've connected at a heart level and at a head level. And so finally, I want to just call a plea that the importance of what you are doing. The business community in the United States today, to me, has a unique position. They are viewed by most of the public as the ability to lead our politicians. It used to be the business community waited for the politicians to lead or do something, and they would respond to it. The business community is going to have to lead the politicians. They've done it around the country. I could give you example after example after example where the politicians messed up, the business community interceded and say, you need to do it this way, whether it's a response to something that they thought was discriminatory to one group or another, or a response to something that was a change the climate so people who didn't have the jobs they wanted. But the business community has a unique responsibility in this to lead in that, because here's why. Leaders don't lead. The leaders in Springfield don't fundamentally lead. The leaders in Washington don't fundamentally lead. They follow. And they follow where we tell them to go, where we want them to go, or we show them to go. And the best leaders, pick out the best leaders that you can find. They figure that out. They figure out where the country and the aspirational quality of the country is, and where the country wants to go, or where the state wants to go, and what their dreams are, and what do they really want, and gets 1/2 step in front of where it's already moving. And then try to constructively figure out their way through that. And so our responsibility, yours and mine, but yours as a business community in this, is how do we lead our leaders? Because ultimately, when we do, they will follow. So thank you for your time. Good luck on your stuff today, and I really appreciate being here.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Cindy Tomei with the IMA. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts this afternoon. I'd love your perspective on the Electoral College. Is it still viable and still in our nation's best interest?
So that's a very good, interesting start. I love your question because sometimes when I've gone to these questions, one of the things I say is no Chris Matthews questions, right? Uh-oh. If anybody's watched Chris Matthews, and I was on his show about 10 years ago, and he did one of his 5-minute long things, right, that he goes and does. And I said to him, he went through one of those with me, and he turns to me and says, so? And I said, Chris, when you tie 500 words together and put a question mark at the end of it, doesn't make it a question. So I appreciate the brevity of your question. The Electoral College is with us as long as I can see. It's part of our system. The ability to change that. It's funny because Republicans years ago wanted to change the Electoral College because it wasn't working in their best interest, and now there's many Democrats who feel like it does not working in their best interest. It's here to stay. I actually think the bigger problem that we have is not the Electoral College, is that the campaigns limit themselves to only competing and talking to a small group of people, so to a small number of states. I think the total number of states that were visited, by and large, were 11 or 12 states, right, in the system that we have. And I would say Hillary Clinton didn't lose because of the Electoral College. Hillary Clinton lost because of a campaign and because of a message and because of things that did not appeal to enough voters in Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and those places in that. And so I think the Electoral College is here to stay, even if you want it. I think it could be adjusted. I think there's adjustments that could be made on it, and it doesn't have to. Each state can make an adjustment. You can allocate your electoral votes by congressional district, which I don't think would be a bad. Maine chooses their Electoral College based on congressional district. Nebraska chooses their Electoral College based on a congressional district, so they give 2 for the senators and then break it down. And that actually causes people to sort of start moving around. Our Electoral College is here to stay, but I also think it has a benefit because I think you want a presidential campaign run on an idea that it can appeal to a majority of the country. And this is part of my problem with the 2 parties, not to go take this question, is both political parties today don't look like the country as a whole. Both political parties today do not look like the country as a whole. One party, as you can see, it dominated geographically. The other party is a different geographic. One party has different demographics. The other party has a different set of demographics, a different set of issues, all of those things. And when you look at it together, they don't look like the country as the whole. And so if there are adjustments to be made, I think that would be great. But I think our Electoral College is here to stay. And I think it's a benefit if the campaigns broaden and talk to enough of the American public.
Thank you.
So it sounds like we'll take one more, or whatever he says.
Thanks, Matthew. Pete Colorelli from Citgo. You talk about how difficult it is for people to collaborate.
Are you the one with a bunch of kids?
I'm with 10 kids too.
Yeah,
so,
yeah. He came up to me and said, we bonded.
So,
you're Catholic too, right?
I am.
So am I. I'm Catholic.
I married an Irish
I
girl,
tell people I'm one of 11 kids, and they say, well, Catholic or Mormon? And that's what they usually say.
Too.
And then I say, well, I'll tell you, my siblings' name is Mary, Patrick, Matthew, Michael, Dan, Paul, Katie, Kelly, Beth, John, Steve, and they go, okay, Catholic. Bingo. Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
So my question is this. If you're operating from different sets of facts, you said how difficult it is to collaborate when you are. There has to be a first mover. Where do you go? Do you go to natural law? Like, how do you get to that point where you have agreed upon facts so that you can now talk about things in a rational way?
Well, so, I mean, that's obviously a great philosophical, could be theological, could be many parts of that question in that. I would say the first thing you do is if you're feeling all cozy with something you just heard, you're probably confirming a bias that you just had. If the feeling you have is I just watched that, I feel good about myself, and I feel so much more confident, you probably just confirmed some level of bias. And so I would say the first thing you do, I mean, obviously there's writings and truth about many different things that you can look at, but is expose yourself to diverse opinions first, and spend some time in quiet. Spend some time because the truth is usually discovered after reading, after all the things we hear, in solitude, in some level of solitude. And if you think about the history of every great leader in the world, most of them spiritual leaders and all that, has spent a huge amount of time in solitude, in a place of contemplation. How do I do this with this? So I would say first, expose yourself to multiple diverse opinions, readings, and read outside of the thing that you're doing, right? If the thing you're doing is business, then read about some philosophical debate about something. Or if your thing is philosophy, then read about how businesses moves and all of those sorts of things. So create a level of diversity, but find a place of solitude to have a place of quiet so you can find that center in you. Thank you again for your time. I really appreciate it.